One possible starting point is to think about comparing different mythologies of creation of different cultures and religions. The Christian myth of creation, as it appears in the Genesis, if compared to another set of myths of creation, is rather peculiar. It is a myth that believes in the creation of a collection of environments, and subsequently the creation of human beings, and specifically of man. This creation of man implies a relation of domination, instructions and rights with his environment in order to subordinate everything that surrounds him. Also with the fact that woman is created as an appendix of man, we find a method of creation that already has the fundamental aspects of patriarchal hierarchy and domination. It is very signifying that this is the myth of creation. Making a step forward, there is an important historic preview in which we find that Christianity and what is called Western Europe today jumps ahead from its relatively small, fenced provinciality and defined territory surrounded on one side by the sea and on the other by the Islamic world. America at that point had very little importance since the main economic powers were focused between Asia and Europe. Subsequently, there are a handful of very important events that relate to America: the beginning of modernism, the emergence of capitalism, and the jump that represented the advent of Western Europe's control over the trade routes across the Atlantic and the slave trade in America. All of these dynamics are the pillars that served as a base for 18th century Western Europe to become the dominant economic power. The impact of this change, the discovery of all that was starting to become the global world at that point already, had an extraordinarily important effect on how the world was understood and how time was perceived. It was the first time that Europe began to see the world as a whole body, to classify cultures and historical times, obviously from a Eurocentric point of view, but with the aim to cover a totality. You then start to identify among some thinkers the linear and sequential constructions of the different possibilities of interpretation that emphasized some aspects but dismissed others from different options and possibilities of historical reality. Some paths were chosen, while others were discarded. These options, of course, were taken depending on the individual and the particular position of those in power, as well as from the vision of the world in which they belonged. The ones that were chosen were the ones that they thought could communicate and had a resonance within a shared common sense. We can then start to see some of the events that are remarked historically historically as milestones in the development of modern science, from which it's important to distinguish paradigmatic theories of people like Bacon and Descartes. In Bacon we find a visionary and extraordinarily modern notion of the future that later constitutes itself as modernity.
Hello there. Welcome to Moody Institute of Science. Say, do you like mystery stories? Well, we have one for you. In the tradition of all good mysteries, it's complete with a haunted house and ghosts out of the past. A science lab seems a strange place to look for ghosts, doesn't it? But our story is true. Before we're finished, I think you'll agree that truth is stranger than the strangest fiction.
This notion essentially suggests that humanity is defenseless in front of the powers of nature, and that humanity has no tools to confront that, so that the only way to confront is through knowledge. The task of scientific knowledge and thought is to detect regularities, to transform and to submit nature. It is like a call to war to subordinate nature. This is a call that essentially says knowledge's use is a tool to subordinate, to dominate, and to improve our material gain. This is a very potent idea that today doesn't appear to be revolutionary as it is now part of our common sense. But at that time, it was quite a radical stance to take in relation to the past. Relating to this logic is Descartes' vision of the possibility to separate subject from object, reason from body. The subject of knowledge is not the human, nor the body, but reason. This notion that knowledge is reason has huge consequences, because it is a notion that separates the process of accumulation of knowledge from the conditions of production of knowledge, transforming reason itself into the subject. In other words, if you have the notion that reason is the subject of knowledge, then knowledge depends fundamentally on the application of methods. Reason applies method, and through this method, you absorb objective and universal knowledge. This notion of thought has a radical and revolutionary aspect, but once again, this has become common sense in today's world because science is now recognized as a searcher of objective and universal knowledge. Universal objective knowledge does not depend on the subject that it knows, and since it is universal, neither does it depend on the historical and social context, power relations, cosmology, etc. This potent affirmation, from science's point of view and the scientific method, ends up having an extraordinary consequence. If you have a determined specific place where knowledge occurs, and there is a class-based society, for example, in which there are some groups that dominate and others that are dominated, and the dominating group announces, "Society is by nature a divided society, and the rich have the right to dominate it," then there is the possibility to identify in the subject that announces it that he is not only saying it because he is rich, but that this is only an aspect of why he is saying it. If, on the contrary, a discourse is built that has no subject announcing it, because it is a notion of abstract reason that uses a scientific method, then it becomes completely objective, and it is a reason that has no subject. In this way, you build a concealed subject that historically is possible to identify with a lot of clarity. It is a masculine, privileged, white European subject.
In accordance with our instructions, we continued toward the planet which its inhabitants call the Earth, in order to study their mode of life. The intelligent creatures on this planet call themselves human beings, and they exist in an amazing variety of conditions. Some live in heat-laden jungles, wearing very little clothing on their bodies. We found others who cover their bodies with great gaudiness, even though the heat may be just as great. Some shovel food into their mouths with tiny silver utensils. Some use sticks of bamboo wood. And some use the 5 tentacle-like extensions which grow from the lower part of each hand. Some live in huts made from branches and leaves which grow abundantly nearby. And some laboriously build huge structures which they slowly fashion out of steel and stone. And yet, in spite of these great differences, we found that all these human beings share many things in common. Each group has built up its own established mode of living together, a network of customs, habits, attitudes, and ways of doing things which it has acquired through the ages. This mode of life is called by the Earth's social scientists the culture of the group. It provides an organized system of behavior for the members of the group, giving them a framework within which to shape their lives and presenting them with common motives and goals toward which they direct their everyday activities. Whether persons belong to a primitive tribe or to a complex civilization, they know fairly well what life has in store for them, because their culture has marked the way.
It is a subject that at least publicly declares itself heterosexual. It is a subject that speaks the legitimate languages of knowledge. He does not speak Quechua or any other native language. The subject only speaks English, French, Latin, etc., making and transforming the others and producers of secondary knowledge of another category. This construction ends up dominating in such a way that even in the historical processes where scientific and cultural knowledge extends itself into other areas of society, it is already concealed with all these patterns of racism, Eurocentricity, nature domination, etc. At this point, it does not really matter who comes in, whether they are black, white, woman, man, African, Southeast Asian, or South American, because they enter with this constituted pattern of knowledge. That is why we speak about a constituted pattern of knowledge that is modern, Eurocentric, patriarchal, and racist, because it conveys all of that, and to dismantle that pattern of knowledge would create the possibility of a condition to overcome the world in which we exist. Another dynamic that accompanies these processes later on is what some feminist critiques called the process of disenchantment from nature, or the killing of the nature. The image of nature, which is holistic and complex, starts to be reduced to a more mechanistic image, to the image of a thing, to the notion that it is a mechanism that can be decomposed and later on analyzed. With that logic, and from the moment that it connects itself with the logic of the expansion of capitalism as a social order that implies competition and growth, this logic of eternal progress and expansion has its means of support from a technological and epistemological point of view, and following this pattern of knowledge at the end becomes one thing, which is the capitalist neocolonial patriarchal pattern. The making of history, the hubris at point zero. The Greek word hubris means prepotency, excessive pride, to believe that you are the owner of all. The hubris at point zero, taken from that stance, is like the production of knowledge that oversees everything, cannot be questioned, and therefore cannot be criticized. The two most influential branches of Western political thought in the 20th century were liberal capitalism on one side and Marxist-Leninism on the other. They share a fundamental aspect, a blind trust in the possibility for scientific truth. They also share with Bacon the notion that it is possible from truth to build the best possible society. Bacon's utopia includes Solomon's house. In Solomon's house, you find the experts who are the ones who organize society from scientific knowledge. That is exactly the same as what Kant proposes in the 19th century, with the notion that the problems we have in society only relate to the concept that we don't know enough about the functional laws in society, so we organize and decide things from ignorance. Only when we achieve enough scientific knowledge of how society actually functions, then the sociologists, who are like the technocrat priests, will have the capacity from their own truth to scientifically organize society. Marxist-Leninism uses the same logic when it proposes that the avant-garde has the capacity to understand the dynamics of history and law. In material dialecticism, you can find that notion of truth. Science not always knew the truth, but there is a kind of approximation that is getting closer to the truth, and that same truth, where there is a dominant class that represents the well-being of humanity, and there is an avant-garde that can express the interest of that class, then from there you can dictate how to organize things and what direction to take, because it is not an opinion, but it is the truth. This, at the end, is actually exactly the same as the technocratic thought of the capitalist and liberal society. The necessity to detach politics from truth is a condition of freedom. There is a wonderful quote by Adorno that says, The absolute certainty is always lacking freedom. There is no possibility of freedom when you think it from the truth, because one of the characteristics of this pattern of knowledge is precisely its linear pattern. From this singular linear pattern, you are not only saying that knowledge is understood from it, but that it transcends into culture itself. Culture can only be built from this singular pattern. One of the things that make easier to understand the logic of the scientific method and the logic of science as an institution is when you read Max Weber speaking of the forms in which modern reason detaches itself from different dimensions. Modern reason detaches itself into a dimension of instrumental reason, a dimension of ethic reason, and a dimension of aesthetic reason. The criteria that operate the dimension of instrumental reason are the criteria of truth, efficiency, and everything that relates to this. The criteria that governs the dimension of aesthetic reason relates to beauty, ugliness, and conceptions of that type. Those relating to the ethic reason have to do with what is just, unjust, lawful, unlawful, etc. But then science operates within the dimension of instrumental reason, and in order to operate it, has to detach itself from the rest. Modern science functions with the logic that the responsibility of a scientist is to give knowledge back to society, although in many cases, not even society itself, but rather the companies that finance the research and what is going to be done with this knowledge is not its responsibility. In other words, if society decides to regulate or not to regulate the research's outcome, that is a problem of another sphere, not the problem of the production of knowledge. The people, on the other hand, assume that the scientist, who is a human being, has an ethic and aesthetic responsibility within the society in which he lives, and that he is acting under the principle of precaution. If this happens, what would happen?
Has the knowledge we've been discussing created a Frankenstein monster which is about to destroy us? Has science somehow become an evil thing? No. True science is a body of fact, and facts are not of themselves immoral. They become good or bad merely in the use to which we put them. The very formulas and facts which gave man the ability to blast himself into eternity, these very facts contain powerful moral and spiritual implications which just might keep him from doing it. Now, we've considered some weird and fantastic things, but the implications to which we have just referred are the strangest and the most fantastic of all. Gives you something to think about, doesn't it? You know, it's an important thing for us to recognize the possibility that every act, good or bad, lives on and on, that we are forever accountable for our actions. But responsibility is the stuff of which character is made. And accepting a full measure of responsibility is the highest challenge before any young person today.
Griffon.